So up until now, we've been using on our in our Gloo config, we've been using essentially this remote address as a way to kind of trigger a rate limit, and we've been using some other things like the generic key or the method of the request. But we actually have a pretty extensive ability to rate limit on any header that is coming in. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of this demo is essentially introduce a scenario with a few different limits based on 2 headers. And then we'll start to kind of see how we can make that more secure by, rather than just relying on the client to set the header, we can kind of extract it from a JWT, and we can layer on other forms of security. So the first thing I want to do is talk through what our new rules are. So basically, we're going to throw out all of the config we had before around remote address per minute, around those usage plans. Now we're going to have 2 criteria to rate limit on. The first, and they're both going to be headers, though from the point of view of Gloo settings, it doesn't really matter where they come from, but we'll see how we populate them in a second. But really, we're going to have 2 different kind of keys. One is the type of message, and the other is the number of the message. And so this is kind of it's kind of simulating a telecom style use case. And different possible types include things like Messenger and WhatsApp. And so what these rules are basically expressing are, it's using a few different features of Gloo called nesting and rule priority, but essentially what we're expressing is for any request that comes in of type Messenger, it always gets rate limited at 2 per minute. For anything that comes in with type WhatsApp, by default, we'll rate limit at 1 per minute. But if it is to the number 411 for WhatsApp, we'll give it a much larger limit of 30 requests per minute. And we're using a weight here to kind of inform Gloo of how to order and prioritize these rules. Basically, what it's saying is, if this rule gets hit, this more specific one for the number, then we won't increment this counter. So we won't we won't be rate limited on this. So we'll allow WhatsApp messages to 411 go through even after we've hit our kind of fallback limit. On the Gloo config side, so for our route, we're going to basically trigger off of 2 different headers. So if only the X type header is present, we'll increment that. And sorry, let me say that slightly differently. We'll always increment 1 counter just with the X type, just based off of X type for the type tuple. Essentially, that links us to that first rule and basically ensures that, if a Messenger request comes in after 2 of them, we'll rate limit because of that first rule. We'll also take an action on the type and number tuple so that we can get to that nested rule as well. So let's see these in action. First, I'll apply the patch to my settings. Oops, cool. And then I'll apply this virtual service. Okay, so now we're going to be, well, let's see this, let's make sure things are working. Okay, everything looks good. We're not getting rate limited. Now let's actually start to trigger, and actually for the purpose of making this a little easier to read, since the text is so big, I'm just going to leave it without the verbose flag. If we don't get a response, that indicates that we have been rate limited for now. We'll bring back verbose a little bit later. But let's see these specific rules being enforced. So remember, for Messenger, we had a limit of 2. As we can see on the 3rd request, we're not seeing a response. That means we're hitting our rate limit after 2 requests. Even when even when we're rate limited there, we still can see WhatsApp messages going through, but the limit there is really, you know, it's just one request. So after the first one, we get rate limited there as well. But if we add the number, $411, then we'll see the request go through. And let's just prove it, you know, we're rate limited currently, but if we add that extra number, the request is not rate limited. So we can see all three of our kind of rules, different rules are taking effect exactly as we expect. So this is the foundation of this demo. Now I'm going to start to pick it apart and show kind of different ways that it's flawed and how we can address those flaws. The first flaw here is that if we don't specify a type that's well defined in our settings, then we won't enforce any rate limit whatsoever. So, you know, I don't think it wasn't really intended that a different header here would have led to no rate limiting at all. We just forgot to introduce a fallback rule. So fixing that's pretty easy. We can just add one more different rate limit just on type, but with no specific value. And that kind of creates our fallback. So let's patch and add that. And as we can see, it immediately takes effect. Now, you know, now any other type, unknown type, is rate limited just as we expect. Now there's some other there's some other cases like this, which I'll come back to because we might want to utilize some security features to block other types of requests, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. The next flaw that we need to address is the fact that right now we're placing the onus on the user or the client to provide honest headers on which we can actually do the rate limiting. So for instance, if the client, you know, specified something different, or if they omitted the header, we wouldn't trigger our rules. That isn't really what we want. What we really want is something where we know that some authoritative source kind of gave us the values of the type and of the number. So what we can actually do is we can move that. You know, we can basically leave rate limiting as is. But what we want is we want incoming requests to have a valid JWT, a valid JWT, which is a token that indicates that we've authorized them to access our service. So we want that JWT verification. And then we want to extract from the JWT, if it's valid, different claims and put them into these two headers. So rather than have the client supply the two headers, they'll supply a valid JWT, and from that JWT we'll extract the type and number because they came actually from whoever provided that JWT, which is a known authority. So let's see what we need to do to actually enable that. The first thing I've done is just, you know, created for the purpose of testing a public and private key pair. And in terms of the JWT, you know, all we need to change about our virtual service, about our Gloo config, is we want to add that JWT configuration. So all I've done is you know, we're doing local verification. So I'm providing the public key and the issuer, so we can kind of have Envoy validate that the JWT associated with the requests is actually valid. It's looking for that token in the X token header or in the token query param. We'll use that header to supply it. And there's one other feature that's utilized here. So to tie it to our rate limit config, we'll basically extract those two values from those two headers. Cool. So we can actually just go and apply this. We don't need to make any other configuration change to Gloo because we've already set up the rate limits that we want. We're just kind of supplying those values from a new source. So let's update our route. And what we should start to see are requests coming back. If we look closer, we're actually getting a 401 unauthorized response now, which is exactly what we expect because we're not supplying a valid JWT, and that is what's required based on our route configuration. I've gone ahead and created a few for us, just kind of emulating the scenarios that we looked at just when we supplied the headers directly. So first I've got a JWT, and I'll show you one of them just to kind of prove it. There's a useful tool called on JWT.io to actually construct these or to decode them. So as we can see, the payload of this contains our issuer, and it contains a type of messenger, and Gloo can validate that this thing is actually valid. And now we can see this request is going through as we expect. And after 2, it's getting rate limited. So this is actually behaving exactly as we expect by changing the config from just a header, by adding in the JWT configuration to extract the header. We are able to kind of work with our existing rate limit config. And just to, one other thing that's worth proving is this, helps protect against something like this, where a user is actually just supplying a fake type header. By the time this request actually gets all the way to our service, we know that that header has been actually written by our JWT filter. So it's it doesn't matter what the user provides, as long as they provide a valid JWT, this will work as we expect. And we can kind of continue it for the other examples. So this is of the type WhatsApp, and this one, is rate limited just after 1. But if we supply something with WhatsApp and the number 411, we can see the type WhatsApp, we can see number 411, and we can see that it's not getting rate limited because we have that larger limit associated with that specific combination. Great. So last thing I want to show, and then we'll kind of open it up for, then we'll close this out and then open it up for questions. But, we layered basically one set of security features on top, which is utilizing JWT verification to require that our clients have valid JWTs, and to extract, and to rely on our identity management system to kind of indicate what we should, our plan, and then actually rate limit based on that trusted authority. But there's some other limitations or some other kind of weaknesses still. This is much more secure than what we had before, but there are some other limitations. So the first is, we might want to add in some kind of web application firewall in front to actually block malicious looking traffic. The second is we might want to also incorporate some kind of authorization. For instance, we might want to inspect the payload of the JWT, and if there's no type at all, or if the type isn't one of the ones that we've written a rate limit quota for, maybe we want to reject it as an unauthorized request instead. So these kinds of things are really easy to kind of layer on top, just to kind of get you, security from every different angle. So let me just apply that real quick. And now we can kind of start to see some interesting things. So this is the request before. It was, valid WhatsApp request. But if if this looks like it's malicious according to our WAF configuration, oh, that didn't. Looks like our updated config didn't take hold yet. Oh, because I forgot to apply the other resources. Okay, so now we can see if, now that this triggers a rule that we had put in front for our WAF, so we actually can get an intervention even before rate limiting. We can also layer rate limit on top of other features like OPA or like external auth, and in that way we can do things like block requests as unauthorized if they're for a type that we don't approve. So going back to our SMS example, if we wanted to, we could have a valid token that came from our authoritative source, but if it still may not be valid for this route based on our auth config, and in that case, we can kind of see a forbidden in the way that we expect. So this is just to show, you know, there's a lot of different angles that you would want to think about in addition to rate limiting when you are using rate limiting as a way to secure and expose your API. Gloo makes it really easy to start to layer those on top of each other. So, you know, we looked at how we could just do that through extracting headers. We made that significantly better by incorporating the JWT filter and extracting it from JWT claims. But we can even do better and layer additional security features on top.